Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to our community partners who are supporting today's program: the Jackson Foundation, Historic Seattle, the Washington State Historical Society, and the Henry M. Jackson High School. When a student was asked after studying the Holocaust, "How does change begin with you?" the student replied, "I will sit with that kid who eats alone every lunch period." We have mountains of anecdotal evidence to show the positive effects of Holocaust education. This past week, a new survey was released showing the impact learning about the Holocaust can have on students. The study surveyed college students and compared the responses of those who had studied the Holocaust in high school to those who had not. The study was commissioned by Echoes and Reflections, a partnership of the ADL, Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. We know that Holocaust education changes lives and makes a difference. This new study quantifies some of the anecdotes. One of the results particularly stood out to me. This is a little small, but let me tell you what it says. Students were asked, "Some of your fellow students are harassing an acquaintance online. How do you react?" Students who studied the Holocaust in high school were more likely to support the victim. Students who studied the Holocaust in high school were more likely to intervene, and they are less likely to do nothing. Students who study the Holocaust are less likely to be bystanders. Learning about the Holocaust has the power to motivate people to action. At the Holocaust Center for Humanity, this is our specialty. On September 25th, next week Friday, please join us online for our annual Voices for Humanity program. Your support and your attendance will help us to bring Holocaust education to even more students. You can register on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org, and click on Voices for Humanity on the homepage. Every voice makes a difference. In 1945, Nazi camps were being liberated, and the world was forced to recognize the genocide that had occurred under their noses. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a graduate of Everett High School and the University of Washington, was a witness to the aftermath at Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany, shortly after its liberation in 1945. What he saw there haunted him and influenced the rest of his long political career. The legacy of Senator Scoop Jackson can be felt in institutions throughout the region, including at the Jackson Foundation, which created a Young Professionals Leadership Program. In 2015, I was fortunate to be selected as one of 8 people to participate in the inaugural cohort. We spent a year diving into leadership training, meeting with influential policymakers, and sharing ideas. At a time now when our world feels more divided and politicized than ever, I am inspired by Scoop Jackson's willingness to constantly seek out perspectives and opinions different than his own. He deliberately went looking for opposing viewpoints in order to better understand them and in order to better understand where weaknesses might lie in his own opinions. He refused to surround himself with people who only thought like he did. Of the many things that Senator Jackson is known for, it is his leadership style and his ability to work across party lines. It's an honor to have with us today Marie Laurence and Craig Gannett. Marie is the daughter of the late Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. She is a former lawyer who has been an active board member of the Jackson Foundation since the early 1990s. Craig Gannett worked for Senator Jackson as counsel to the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee from 1981 to 1983. He's a partner in the Seattle office of Davis Wright Tremaine, where he practices in the fields of energy and climate change. He's also president of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, chair of the advisory board to the Jackson School of International Studies, and teaches climate change law at the UW Law School. His late mother-in-law, Lily Cirillo, was a native of Germany and was the only member of her family to escape the Holocaust. Thank you so much, Marie and Craig, for being with us today.
Thank you, Ilana, so much. It's a pleasure for myself and for Craig to be here and be part of this program. We look forward to sharing with you about how the Holocaust really shaped Scoop in his human rights work. So thank you for giving us that opportunity. Right now, I am in our family home in Everett on Grand Avenue. And behind me, you can see my father's library. He spent a lot of time here when he was in Everett, working on issues and meeting with his staff. So it's a special, comforting place for me. So today I just want to take a few moments and kind of talk a little bit about Scoop and how he grew up and a little bit about his background, and then the experiences that he saw when he went to Buchenwald. So for those of you who were too young to know, and I expect that that's most of you, my dad grew up in Everett, Washington. He was the son of Norwegian immigrants. Okay, next slide. Yes, thank you, Richard. Scoop graduated from the University of Washington Law School in 1935. And after graduation, he worked for a few years at an Everett law firm. Then in 1938, he was elected prosecuting attorney for Snohomish County. He prosecuted a high-profile double homicide case, and that publicity that he received from the case gave him the recognition he needed to run for the US House of Representatives. Dad was elected to the House in November of 1940. Here you can see a photo of his parents and sister getting him ready to go on the airplane back to Washington, D.C. He arrived in the Capitol on January 2nd, 1941. He was one of the youngest elected representatives in the country at the age of 28. By then, Hitler had already conquered most of Europe, but Pearl Harbor was still almost a year away. Scoop served in the House for 12 years until 1952, when he was elected to the US Senate, where he served for over 30 years. He remained in the Senate until 1983, when he died in office at the age of 71. Scoop worked with 9 presidents. Scoop also, he ran for president in 1972 and 76. My mother, Helen, was an active campaigner traveling around the country on his behalf and making speeches. They attended many events together, and here you can see on the slide in the upper left-hand corner, my parents, and they were at the Democratic National Convention in Miami in 1972. So how did my parents meet? Well, my parents met in an elevator in the US Capitol when my mom was working for Senator Clinton Anderson from New Mexico. Senator Anderson introduced my mom to my dad when my dad was going in for his swearing-in ceremony to the Senate. Anyway, they got married in 1961, and their first date was, excuse me, tea in the Senate dining room. My parents had 2 children, myself and my younger brother, Peter. As kids, we would spend our school year in Washington, D.C., and then summers and Christmas in Everett, Washington. There we are on the bicycles in Williamsburg and over in Mukilteo, playing around. We just had a great time. Lots of fun family time for sure. And Dad felt that that was really important because he was a very busy person, but he always made time for his family. So now let's take a step back to September 1943. Dad signed up for the Army at Fort Lewis and went through basic training in Alabama. But President Roosevelt ordered all members of Congress out of the military before the unit was shipped off to Italy. On April 22nd, 1945, he and several other congressmen visited Buchenwald at the invitation of General Eisenhower, just 11 days after General Patton's Third Army had liberated the death camp. What he saw horrified him. In a letter to the Bellingham Guide, he describes the conditions and horrors from his visit. Prisoners were housed in long, low, rectangular wooden buildings. The maximum number of people it should house was 300, but the Germans would fill a building with 2,300 people. Sanitation was terrible. Sleeping accommodations were 6 men to a bunk that would normally hold no more than 1, maybe 2 people. Most of the prisoners were starved and too weak to move. Approximately 100 people a day would die of malnutrition alone. There was an experimental laboratory that was set up for human vivisection. Scientists and doctors would perform various experiments on the prisoners, which usually resulted in their deaths. The wife of the camp commander who examined prisoners that had tattoos, selecting the best tattoos to be removed by doctors so that she could make lampshades out of human skin. This resulted in many deaths. When my father was walking to the extermination center, he noticed numerous bodies stacked in a truck, barely recognizable as human beings. Inside the extermination center, there were hooks on the walls where the inmates would be hung with a rope around their necks until they strangled to death. Those that did not die fast enough were hit over the head with a club. And my father saw that club. A noise machine had been set up, drowning out the screams and moans. It's estimated that 51,000 people, 51,000 people died in Buchenwald, either by starvation or some form of execution. So this brings me to some items here that you can see on the screen. These items were given to my father when he visited Buchenwald. He kept them in the house that he grew up in, and later they were moved to our house on Grand and put in a trunk up in the attic. Before my brother Peter passed away in March this year, we decided that these items should be donated to the Holocaust Center for Humanity as reminders that these horrors and atrocities that happened in Buchenwald and throughout Germany and Poland under Hitler's rule were real and must never be forgotten. So now I would like to turn the next part of our program over to Craig Gannett, who will give you some background on Jackson-Vanik and the Magnitsky Act. Craig?
Thank you, Anna Marie. I want to pick up the story with a speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave early in World War II, in which he talked about fighting for the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, a rather broad agenda. In his view, World War II was a fight fundamentally for human rights. After the war, that idea evolved into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948 with strong US support. Eleanor Roosevelt, shown here with a copy of the Declaration, led the US delegation, who was really one of the prime movers in getting the Declaration adopted by the UN. The Declaration is extraordinarily broad. It provides that all humans are to enjoy certain fundamental rights, including the right to life, liberty, personal security, and to a free, a fair, and public hearing before an impartial court. It also declares the right to be free from discrimination, to be free from arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, and for our purposes, perhaps most importantly, the right to be free to leave one's country. The Declaration has been called the Magna Carta for all humanity. So as Anna Marie mentioned, 4 years later, 1952, Scoop is elected to the Senate. We were in the early phases of the Cold War, and he increasingly spoke out against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Fast forward a couple of decades to 1972, the Kremlin attempted to suppress the number of Soviet Jews seeking to immigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel. Part of this was to placate Arab country concerns about an increase in the population of Israel. But there was also a humiliation felt by the Soviet leadership at the surprising number of highly educated Jews, scientists, professors, and musicians who wanted to leave, thereby decimating the vaunted Soviet intelligentsia. So Moscow's answer was not to improve conditions, but rather to impose a diploma tax, the size of which was linked to the level of education of the potential emigre. This tax, which typically was 10 to 20% of an average annual salary, effectively made it impossible for Soviet Jews to obtain a visa. At about this time, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger were striving to achieve what was called détente with the Soviets. The goal of détente was to lessen tensions, allowing for a more constructive relationship between the two great powers. Part of the strategy was to enter into a major trade agreement with the Soviets to bind the two countries closer together. But Scoop had a different perspective. He fundamentally distrusted the Soviets and saw détente as misguided, if not naive. Instead, he took a much more confrontational approach. And when he saw this trade agreement coming before the Senate for approval, he saw an opportunity to exert leverage. So, along with Congressman Charles Vanik, a Democrat from Ohio, he crafted an amendment that conditioned the most favored nation treatment under this trade agreement for any non-market economy country on the right of that country's citizens to emigrate. The amendment didn't explicitly name the Soviet Union. It applied to any, quote, non-market economy, end quote, and it didn't explicitly apply to Jews. It applied to citizens. But the primary aim was to force the Soviet Union to let its Jews go. Scoop explicitly based his amendment on the Declaration. When he introduced the amendment in the summer of 1972, he said, "Of all the individual liberties contained in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, none is more fundamental than that of Article 13, the right to free immigration." He saw it as a lifeline for victims of religious and racial oppression throughout the world. There you see a picture of Senator Jackson, along with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature based on the Gulag Archipelago and other great works of literature, along with a junior Delaware senator who went nowhere thereafter. So Nixon and Kissinger vehemently opposed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. In their view, there was no linkage between, there should be no linkage between human rights and positive relations between great powers. They were strong believers in what is sometimes referred to as realpolitik. And the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, agreed with them. He objected to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment as an unacceptable interference in the internal affairs of the Soviet Union. Now you see a picture of Senator Jackson and Nixon in happier times. We look for a picture of the two of them, perhaps even with Kissinger when they were negotiating the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, but to no avail. Perhaps that wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have been quite in such a sunny mood. But so the situation was that despite their opposition to the amendment, to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, Nixon, Kissinger, and Brezhnev had a problem. Scoop had 75 co-sponsors for amendment upon introduction. Can you imagine that today? You had roughly 20 Republicans who had joined Senator Jackson in proposing and supporting an amendment that they knew was adamantly opposed by their president. So clearly the Jackson-Vanik Amendment wasn't going to go away. And so that led to a stalemate for the next 2 years, from 72 to 74, until fortuitously, Nixon was forced to resign in August of 1974. President Ford took a much more conciliatory approach, and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment became law as part of that trade legislation signed by Senator Ford in early 1975. And so now you see a picture of Scoop in Jerusalem celebrating with Russian Soviet immigrants who had made it to Israel. He was certainly a hero in their view for having created the leverage that resulted in their ability to emigrate. So in the next 20 years, over 1 million Jews emigrated from the Soviet Union, later Russia. This was obviously a huge victory, vindicating Scoop's view that human rights should not be swept under the rug when you're dealing with a totalitarian adversary. Here you see, this is in 1995, Helen with a plaque that marks Jackson Square in Jerusalem. So this would have been a fitting end of the story. Scoop had prevailed and then died 8 years later, knowing that he had made a real difference. But there's much more to the story. Russia continued to bridle under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, particularly the requirement of annual certification by the State Department that Russia continued to allow free immigration. And it particularly bothered the new Russian president who took office in 1999, one Vladimir Putin. Yes, 21 years ago, Vladimir Putin first became president of Russia. He argued that because they were allowing free immigration, Russia had earned the right to, quote unquote, graduate from the Jackson-Vanik annual certification process. And the US State Department agreed. In 2002, the State Department told Congress that Russia has come very far forward since the fall of the Soviet Union. It is no longer the enemy, they said, as President George W. Bush had said many times. And the State Department urged Congress to put aside the relics of the Cold War and graduate Russia from the Jackson-Vanik annual certification process. But the Jackson-Vanik Amendment survived for another decade until another event intervened. In 2012, as part of his attempt to reset the US relationship with Russia, President Obama supported admitting Russia to the World Trade Organization, WTO. But there was a hitch. The WTO requires that all members give permanent normal trade relations to all other members. But the Jackson Amendment required an annual certification process to assure the free immigration. And therefore, if Russia was admitted to the WTO, the US would immediately be in violation of this WTO requirement. And US companies would not get the advantage of lower tariffs when selling goods to Russia. So for example, if Russian tariffs were of 10% pre-WTO, and they would have lowered to 7.5% under the WTO process, every other country selling into Russia would have only paid a 7.5% tariff, but American companies would have continued to pay the 10% tariff, over time costing hundreds of millions, perhaps billions. So there was a lot of pressure to get rid of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in order to facilitate the benefits of the WTO. But not so fast. At that point, a bipartisan group of congressmen thought about the competing tensions there, and they came to the conclusion that while Jackson-Vanik had indeed outlived its usefulness in terms of immigration, Russia was engaged in other human rights abuses. In particular, they pointed to Russian tax lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was beaten to death in a Moscow prison in 2009 after investigating a $230 million fraud involving Russian tax officials. Although there had been many so-called investigations within Russia of Magnitsky's death, absolutely nobody had been held accountable. And there you have a picture of Sergei Magnitsky. So this bipartisan group drafted what became the Russia and Moldova, don't ask me why Moldova is in there, the Russia and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal and Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012, now known as the Magnitsky Act, and attached it to the same legislation that allowed Russia to join the WTO. It imposed sanctions on Russian officials and other individuals involved in the death of Magnitsky and those involved in the corruption that Magnitsky was attempting to expose when he was arrested. Putin, as you can imagine, was very upset about the Magnitsky Act. And at his behest, the Kremlin quickly enacted legislation mimicking the Magnitsky Act, imposing sanctions on Americans involved in, quote, violations of the human rights and freedoms of Russian citizens, end quote. For good measure, the legislation also blocked the adoption of Russian children by Americans, an issue that has resurfaced in the last couple of years, as you may recall. But all of this didn't do anything to deter Congress. In 2016, it went much further by enacting the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, known as GLOMAG. GLOMAG authorizes the Treasury and State Departments to sanction human rights abusers and corrupt government officials anywhere in the world by denying US visas and by freezing all of their US property or interest of property, anything within US or US control. In other words, Congress took tools similar to what were applied to Russia under the 2012 litigation and made them applicable to human rights abuses and financial corruption worldwide. So the timing gets interesting here because GLOMAG was enacted in December 2016, the month after Trump's election. So within a few months, a NGO, non-governmental organization called Human Rights First, a partner and grantee of the Jackson Foundation, began putting pressure on the US government to take action under GLOMAG. And they went out and recruited and coordinated dozens of other NGOs and pro bono attorneys in order to gather and present the credible evidence that individuals around the world were should be subject to sanctions under GLOMAG. And then it was about a year later, in December of 2017, that Trump signed an executive order 13818, for those who might be interested, formally creating the Global Magnitsky sanctions program and releasing its first tranche of designated persons. Now, you may wonder how it is that somebody who doesn't exactly have a stellar record with respect to speaking out on matters of human rights signed an executive order that basically helped implement the Global Magnitsky Act. And but I'll leave that to questions if anybody is interested. I have nothing but speculation, but a couple thoughts on that. So since the sanctions program was launched, the US government has sanctioned well over 200 individuals, corporations, and military units from 25 countries for the commission of either serious human rights abuses or acts of significant corruption. They include Russian individuals, of course, and entities, as well as Saudi Arabian individuals for the murder of journalist and dissident Jamal Khashoggi. And just last month, as you may have seen, sanctions were imposed on a number of Chinese officials for the internment of the Uyghurs. Excuse me. There you see a picture of Jamal Khashoggi and another couple of pictures there. One of the treatment of the Uyghurs by the Chinese, and then on the right is one of the Chinese officials that is subject to sanctions under GLOMAG being served tea there in a rather interesting fashion. But he is now one of those who is officially subject to the sanctions. But it gets better. Versions of GLOMAG have been enacted by other countries, including Britain, Canada, and Lithuania. And legislation of a similar nature is pending in the European Union, Australia, and a half dozen other countries. And so over time, these laws may create sort of an international web, an interlocking web that holds human rights abusers and corrupt officials more accountable. So there you have it, an arc of events that started 75 years ago in Buchenwald has now evolved into an increasingly effective worldwide effort to uphold human rights and punish corruption. It is not anywhere close to a panacea, but at least the perpetrators have reason to fear that their crimes could cause them to suffer real consequences. So, sort of in closing, to continue this legacy, the Jackson Foundation has made human rights a focus since its inception 35 years ago. And just 6 years ago, we created, as Ilana mentioned, a leadership fellows program to prepare the next generation to carry on the fight. And there you see a picture of one of the classes working together. And then on the right-hand side of the photograph, you see the 9 individuals selected for the current incoming class of the Jackson Fellows. We now have almost 50 graduates of that program, and we're confident that they will build on the foundation led by Senator Jackson. And let me just mention that the Jackson Foundation, in addition to human rights, puts an enormous amount of effort into the issue of climate change and to supporting international affairs education at the University of Washington and elsewhere. And we see all of those issues as being connected, as being part of what we need to be doing to help make the world a better place. And we are thrilled that the Jackson Fellows are picking up that gauntlet and will continue those efforts into the coming decades. So with that, Anna Marie and I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Craig and Anna Marie. We have several questions that have come in, and one of them that's been asked by a few different people is to you, Craig. You mentioned you have some speculations and that you would be able to expand on those. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, there's a couple theories. One is that although when Trump is interacting with foreign leaders, he's not one to press them on human rights. But in this case, Trump has another agenda, which is to make China the enemy. And so he may have seen this as an opportunity to show his opposition to all things Chinese. The other theory is that, and I've heard this from Human Rights First, is that there are people in the Treasury Department, the State Department, but the Treasury Department in particular, that do care about this program, and so Secretary Mnuchin has publicly said things very supportive of it, and so this may be one of those instances in which senior level bureaucrats led by a sympathetic presidential appointee are able to advance an agenda that is well founded in law, but is not necessarily a high priority of the president.
Thank you. Anna Marie, this next question is directed to you, and it comes from Ethan, and he asks, if or when did your father tell you about his experiences in Buchenwald?
Oh, thanks for that question. It's similar to what you were alluding to earlier, Ilana. I was learning about the Holocaust in school. And so my dad and I would talk a lot about history, and he liked to quiz me and made sure I understood things and that sort of thing, and liked to discuss his experiences. And so I talked to him about the Holocaust, and that's when he told me about his visit to Buchenwald. And I remember as a kid about him talking about these experimental laboratories where they would perform surgeries on people, and I couldn't believe it. It was just horrific. And he really brought to life what happened there and his feelings about it, and it stuck with him throughout his whole life, and he never forgot. So I hope that answers it. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I think we can really see in his track record and in the way he communicated how this continued to affect him for many, many years.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I would like to say, as a kid growing up, there would be strangers that would come up to me and say, your father allowed me freedom. I was able to leave my country when I wanted to because of your father. And that also really struck me too, that Dad was able to put forth the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and really change lives and help people around the world. And there's something I just wanted to add about that. I was looking through a book called Henry M. Jackson and World Affairs, Selected Speeches, that was written by Dorothy Fosdick, who worked for Scoop for many, many years. And this was a speech that was from the National Conference on Soviet Jewry in Washington, D.C., 17th of May, 1976. And this is what Scoop says about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. He says, quote, "And I remain proud of what we have accomplished. I remain firm in my convictions. I will not retreat. I will not turn my back on those who are struggling to obtain their freedom. They have the will to fight, and I am proud to fight alongside them." And end quote. And you know, Dad was he was steadfast, unwavering. He was courageous, and I admire him for all of those qualities. So.
It's a powerful quote. It's a powerful quote. So this question could go to either one of you. And Craig, you touched on some of this. This question comes from Alan, and he asks, can our country be sanctioned given our record of treatment of Blacks and other minorities?
That is an excellent question. And it depends on how the other country's version of Global Magnitsky is applied. But I think that if the other country, if their statute characterizes what happens in the US as a violation of human rights, you could have sanctions imposed on US officials and individuals for human rights abuses. And so it's a great question, because I'm hoping that there will be a dynamic of countries holding each other accountable in ways that lifts all boats. I don't think that we're quite there yet, but as more and more countries adopt a version of Global Magnitsky and start applying it, we may get a taste of our own medicine in effect, which I think would be very healthy.
So Craig, just to follow up on that, what do you think is needed to have more countries adopt it?
Well, I think that showing how effective it is, you know, how effective the US statute is, would be the best model. If the US statute really causes pain to foreign, you know, to folks in other countries, you know, engaged in human rights abuses or financial corruption, if they really are feel the impact and their conduct changes, that would be the best advertisement for other countries to adopt it. It's you know, and you know, one detail I didn't mention, it really gets down to very sort of day-to-day things. I noticed in looking through one of the materials that Amazon actually paid a $150,000 fine after they voluntarily disclosed that they had delivered a package to somebody that was on the GloMag sanctions list. So you can't engage in business, essentially. I have yet to completely unpack how the details of that work, but there are a number of ways that GLOMAG or statutes adopted by other countries could make the lives of these people really miserable at a very practical day-to-day level that could have, a real impact on their conduct.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Anna Marie, you told us a great story the other day, and a couple people have asked about it, but could you tell us about how your dad got the nickname Scoop and why people called him that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Scoop got his nickname from his older sister, Gert. And there was a comic strip in the Everett Herald called Scoop the Cub Reporter and Cub Reporter. And he was kind of a goofy reporter and he'd do silly things and he'd try to get other people to do his work. And so Dad's older sister Gert thought, oh, that's Scoop for you. That's Henry. I'm going to start calling him Scoop. And so when he was pretty young, I think it was about the age of 8, he got that nickname from his sister and it stuck with him ever since.
Great. So this is to either one of you, and it comes from Lou. I'm not sure. You might be able to see it there in the chat, but I'm going to read it out loud for everybody else. Natan Sharansky said the 3 most important people to free the people of Eastern Europe and Russia to immigrate was Andrei Sakharov, Ronald Reagan, and Senator Jackson. How is President Trump carrying on the fight for human rights around the world? Is President Trump's human rights policies bringing religious and political freedom to other countries?
So I'll jump in on that because it follows up on the question that was asked earlier. We all hear what President Trump says in public, and I think we all agree that that's reprehensible and not to be intolerable, horrible language that he uses both with respect to overseas human rights and to situations that we're currently grappling with in the United States. But on the other hand, he, as I mentioned, has facilitated the implementation of GLOMAG, and it is having real impact overseas. So, it's sort of an example of when you dig into the details, everything's complicated. There are layers upon layers, and they don't all point the same direction. So, I think that one has to give President Trump credit for having allowed the GLOMAG program to move forward vigorously, and that is part of one aspect of what he's doing. But there's no denying that he deserves some credit for facilitating the implementation of GLOMAG. If I can jump in, I saw part of another question, but it's a really important point that I should have mentioned. GLOMAG is due to sunset in 2 years. I'm not exactly sure why Congress set a sunset date on it. Most often they don't, but on occasion when they want to revisit a policy, they establish a sunset date, and the sunset date for GLOMAG is 2 years. And so assuming it continues to function well, it's going to be really, really important to extend and hopefully make permanent that provision. So I want everybody that cares about this issue to be aware of that cliff that is ahead of us.
Yeah, that's good to know, and something for us to look out for. Yeah, that's good to know. There's another question here from Jonathan, who asks, can you speak about any conflict between the Nixon administration and Senator Jackson during the formulation of Jackson-Vanik? Any dirty tricks or efforts from the administration to influence Senator Jackson's disposition?
Anna Marie, I don't have anything on that. I know it was very contentious, and that I think there probably were some mean things said about Scoop that were caught on the Nixon tapes. But he and Kissinger went back and forth on it because Kissinger was really the architect of détente. But I'm not aware of any dirty tricks or anything, any ways in which they went outside the usual bounds of debate. There may have been, but I'm not aware of any.
And I would like to add too, Craig, yes, I'm not aware of anything between my father and Nixon on that. I think it was more going back and forth between Scoop and Secretary of State Kissinger, especially when they were working on a compromise agreement to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that allowed for the waiver. And so then there was this compromise that was between letters that Kissinger had written to my father and my father's response to Kissinger. So that kind of went back and forth, and they came up with this compromise that allowed for the waiver so that the President of the United States, like Ford at the time, could waive restrictions under MFN and credits in exchange for assurances to Congress that large numbers of folks would be allowed to emigrate from the Soviet Union, and also people wouldn't be imprisoned for their beliefs or wanting to leave. So it was basically based on good faith. And my dad relied on that. And then basically after this compromise agreement, I think it was like 8 days later or something, then the Soviets the Russians were basically saying, to Kissinger, there was this secret letter to Kissinger saying, we don't, we repudiate everything that you've assured to Congress. And Dad was never given this letter by Kissinger, nor was anyone else outside of the administration knew about that letter. And it only came to light basically the night before President Ford signed the Trade Reform Act in December of '74, or I guess it was January of '75. But I think Dad was upset by that. And then the other piece to it that was upsetting to him was about 11 days after the bill was signed, so the ink was still wet. The administration was talking about possibly repealing the amendment. And this just really bothered Dad, and basically saying, okay, to the Soviets, we're gonna, we'll work it and we'll make it so things will work out for you, so don't worry about it. And Dad felt, wait a minute, we had this agreement on good faith, and we did this waiver for you, and now what's going on? So I think that's kind of where the tensions came up. But he persevered and was strong in his convictions, and things did work out.
So this is to both or either one of you, and I just wonder, we're in a time in our world where Scoop Jackson never would have predicted anything like what's happening today on, coming at us from so many fronts. What do you think his advice would be to us, or what do you think he would say in this world that we're living in now?
Anne-Marie?
Well, I think Dad would say, you got to know what the facts are, right? You got to know what are the facts, what are the true facts, and then look at history. History is so important. Read your history. Be a student. So those two things. And not to make judgments too early. You got to know your facts first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just add that he was a big fan of bipartisanship. And in his day, bipartisanship worked because there were moderate Republicans that would work with moderate Democrats, and they would sort of link arms, and then the Democrat, usually him, it would fend off attacks from the left, and the moderate Republican partner would fend off attacks from the right. But I think he would be deeply disturbed by the lack of partnership, the unwillingness to compromise and to find a path down the middle. And so, were he hypothetically in the Senate, I expect that he would be reaching out at every opportunity, trying to find somebody who would work with him on a common sense solution. But whether that method works in our current environment, I think is an open question. But he certainly would have made every effort to communicate in an open, transparent, problem-solving fashion, across the aisle.
I think that's something we all can strive for right now. Anna Marie and Craig, thank you both so much for this outstanding presentation and for providing so much information. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us today for this program. We really appreciate both you and Craig, Anna Marie, taking this time and sharing these many stories and this rich information with us and giving us so much to think about. I also want to thank our community partners who helped to support this program today, the Jackson Foundation, of course, Historic Seattle, the Washington State Historical Society, and the Henry M. Jackson High School. And this program has been recorded, so if you want to go back and watch it or know somebody else who might want to watch it later, you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with other past Lunch and Learn programs. And I also want to give a reminder to please join us for the Voices for Humanity virtual program next week, Friday, September 25th. I want to give as well a very special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show, and a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Draytel, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. And for all of you listening, I hope you'll be able to join us next week for a very special program called Segregated King County, Race, Neighborhoods, and Inequality with Professor James Gregory at the University of Washington, who is also the director of the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, and Sean Scott, who's a filmmaker and journalist. And they will explore the history of segregation in Seattle and King County and its ongoing legacy that continues to shape our region. So with that, again, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Craig and Anna Marie, and we hope to see you all at future programs. Thank you so much. This concludes our program for today.